Let me tell you something that's going to make you uncomfortable, and I need you to stay with me because what I'm about to reveal will dismantle one of the most dangerous lies you've been told about your body, your pleasure, and your right to inhabit your sexuality after 60. This isn't about shock value. This is about medical truth, clinical observation, and the stories of hundreds of women who sat in my office believing they had become invisible, irrelevant, or worse, inappropriate for wanting what every human being deserves: connection with their own body and the capacity to experience pleasure without shame, without permission, and certainly without an expiration date stamped on their desire. Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. Subscribe to this channel right now, because what we're going to discuss today will challenge everything you've been conditioned to believe about aging, femininity, and the right to your own body. And tell me in the comments below if anyone has ever made you feel like your sexuality had an age limit, like wanting pleasure after a certain birthday made you somehow broken, desperate, or pathetic. Write it down. I was told I was too old to want this, because that sentence, that belief, that internalized shame is killing something essential in you, and today we're going to resurrect it. The title of this video is deliberately provocative, and you might have clicked thinking I was going to confirm your worst fear, that somehow masturbation after 60 is dangerous, unhealthy, or morally questionable. Let me be crystal clear from the beginning. The fatal mistake isn't masturbation after 60. The fatal mistake is believing you should stop. The fatal mistake is internalizing a culture that has systematically erased older women's sexuality, that has turned desire into something embarrassing, that has convinced you that wanting pleasure, seeking connection with your own body, exploring what brings you joy is somehow undignified at this stage of your life. I am Dr. Valeria Montes, and for over 2 decades I have listened to women in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond describe their relationship with their bodies, their sexuality, their shame, and their hunger for permission to still be alive in their skin. What I've learned isn't just clinical, it's revolutionary, and it contradicts almost everything mainstream culture wants you to believe about aging as a woman. Your body doesn't stop being capable of pleasure at menopause. Your nervous system doesn't retire when you turn 60. Your capacity for orgasm, for arousal, for sexual satisfaction doesn't diminish simply because you've crossed an arbitrary threshold that society has decided marks your transformation from woman to grandmother, from sexual being to sanitized elder. What changes isn't your biology, it's the story you've been told about your biology, and that story is not only false, it's medically harmful. Let me take you into my consultation room for a moment. Patricia walked in 3 months after her 62nd birthday. She sat across from me with perfect posture, impeccable appearance, the kind of woman who has spent her entire life doing everything right, everything expected. She opened the conversation by apologizing, which already told me everything I needed to know. "I'm sorry to waste your time with this, doctor, but I have a question that's been bothering me, and I don't know who else to ask." Patricia had been married for 38 years. Her husband had passed away 14 months earlier, after a long illness during which she had been his primary caregiver. She had adult children, grandchildren, a successful career she had recently retired from. Everything about her life looked complete, finished, neatly packaged, and yet there she was, apologizing for the fact that she still experienced desire, that her body still responded to touch, that she found herself thinking about physical pleasure and feeling profoundly guilty about it. "Is it normal?" she asked me, her voice barely above a whisper, "to still want sex at my age? And if I can't have it with someone, is it wrong to just take care of it myself? My daughter found a vibrator in my drawer when she was helping me organize, and the look on her face, doctor, it was like I'd committed some unforgivable transgression." She didn't say anything, but I could see the judgment, the disgust almost. Now I feel like there's something wrong with me. I looked at Patricia and I asked her a simple question. Do you still experience hunger, thirst? Do you still enjoy the sensation of warm water on your skin when you shower? Do you still find pleasure in music, in the taste of good food, in the feeling of sunlight? She nodded, confused about where I was going. Then why, I continued, would you expect the nerve endings designed specifically for pleasure to suddenly stop functioning? Why would your body's capacity for sexual response be the only biological system that's supposed to shut down completely while everything else continues? That conversation is the foundation of everything we're going to discuss today. Because the question isn't whether women over 60 should masturbate. The question is why we've created a culture so terrified of older women's sexuality that we've pathologized something as natural, as healthy, as fundamentally human as self-pleasure. Let me give you some science that nobody wants to talk about. Your clitoris contains approximately 8,000 nerve endings, more than any other part of the human body, male or female. Those nerve endings don't disappear at menopause. They don't retire when you hit 60. The neurological pathways that connect physical stimulation to pleasure response remain intact throughout your entire life. What changes is hormonal, yes, estrogen levels drop, which can affect lubrication, tissue elasticity, and arousal time. But none of those changes eliminate your capacity for pleasure. None of them make masturbation dangerous or inappropriate. They simply mean you might need to adjust your approach, use lubrication, take more time, communicate differently with your body. Here's what actually happens neurologically when you experience sexual pleasure, whether with a partner or alone. Your brain releases a cascade of neurotransmitters: dopamine, which is associated with reward and motivation; oxytocin, which promotes bonding and reduces stress; endorphins, which are your body's natural pain relievers; and serotonin, which regulates mood. This neurochemical cocktail has profound effects on your physical and mental health. It reduces cortisol levels, lowers blood pressure, improves sleep quality, boosts immune function, and enhances overall sense of well-being. Now ask yourself, at what age does your brain stop benefiting from reduced stress? At what age does your cardiovascular system stop needing the positive effects of lowered blood pressure? At what age does your immune system no longer need support? The answer is never. Your body needs these benefits throughout your entire life, and sexual pleasure, whether partnered or solo, is one of the most accessible ways to activate these health-promoting systems. But let's talk about what really happens when women internalize the message that their sexuality has an expiration date. I've seen it in my practice over and over again. Women stop touching themselves, not because their bodies have stopped responding, but because they've been taught that wanting pleasure at this age is shameful, pathetic, or inappropriate. And when they disconnect from their capacity for physical pleasure, something else happens, something I can track clinically. They report higher levels of anxiety and depression. They describe feeling invisible, not just socially but in their own skin. They lose that sense of aliveness, of vitality, of being present in their bodies rather than merely occupying them. This isn't psychological speculation, it's observable physiology. When you regularly experience pleasure, when you maintain that connection with your body's capacity for sensation and joy, you are actively reinforcing neural pathways that support mood regulation, stress resilience, and overall life satisfaction. When you cut yourself off from those experiences because of internalized shame, you are literally depriving your brain of chemicals it needs to function optimally. One of my patients, Margaret, described it perfectly. She was 67 when she came to see me, struggling with what she thought was clinical depression. She'd been on antidepressants for 3 years with minimal improvement. During our conversation, I asked her about pleasure in general, not just sexual pleasure, but any activity that brought her genuine joy, that made her feel alive in her body. She couldn't name a single one. Everything had become functional, obligatory, going through the motions. We talked about her relationship with her body, with physical sensation, with pleasure. She admitted she hadn't touched herself sexually in over a decade, not because she'd lost interest, but because she'd decided at some point that it was unseemly for a woman her age. She'd stopped dancing, which she used to love. She'd stopped swimming because she didn't want people seeing her body in a swimsuit. She'd systematically disconnected from every activity that involved physical pleasure or sensual awareness. I explained to her that depression isn't always about serotonin deficiency that needs pharmaceutical correction. Sometimes it's about systematic deprivation of the experiences that generate the neurochemicals associated with well-being. Sometimes it's about internalizing a story that tells you you're no longer entitled to pleasure, to joy, to the feeling of being vibrantly alive in your skin. We created a plan that wasn't about sexuality primarily. It was about reclaiming pleasure in all its forms. She started swimming again, early in the morning when the pool was nearly empty. She started dancing alone in her living room. And yes, she started touching herself again, not as a sexual performance, but as a way of reconnecting with her body's capacity for sensation and pleasure. Within 6 months, working with her psychiatrist, she was able to reduce her antidepressant dosage. Within a year, she was off them completely. She described feeling like she'd woken up after years of sleepwalking through her own life. Now I can already hear the objections, the discomfort, the voices telling you this is inappropriate conversation, that there's something unseemly about a doctor discussing masturbation for older women. And that's exactly the problem. We live in a culture that has no trouble discussing erectile dysfunction medications for older men, that plasters advertisements for male sexual enhancement across every media platform, but recoils in disgust at the suggestion that older women might also have sexual needs, desires, and the right to address them. This double standard isn't just unfair, it's medically harmful. It creates an environment where women suffer in silence with decreased libido, painful intercourse, loss of pleasure, and profound disconnection from their bodies because they've been taught that these issues are either inevitable parts of aging that must be endured or embarrassing problems that shouldn't be discussed. Let me tell you what's actually inevitable about aging. Change. Your body changes, your hormones change, your skin changes, your hair changes. But change doesn't mean cessation. It means adaptation. And when it comes to sexuality and pleasure, adaptation might mean using quality lubricants to address vaginal dryness. It might mean exploring different types of stimulation as sensitivity changes. It might mean taking more time, being more intentional, communicating more clearly with your body about what feels good. None of that is tragic. None of that is shameful. It's simply the reality of inhabiting a human body across decades. What is tragic is the number of women who simply give up, who decide that because their sexuality doesn't look or feel exactly the way it did at 30, it must be over. That's like saying because your knees don't work exactly the way they did at 30, you should just stop walking. You don't stop walking, you adapt. You might walk differently, take different routes, use support when needed, but you don't abandon mobility entirely. The same principle applies to sexual pleasure. You don't abandon it because it's changed. You adapt, you explore, you discover what works for your body now in this phase of life. And for many women, particularly those who are no longer in sexual relationships, masturbation becomes not a sad substitute for something lost, but a valuable practice of self-care, body literacy, and pleasure that's entirely on their own terms. Let's talk about body literacy for a moment because this is something I emphasize with all my patients regardless of age. Body literacy means understanding how your body works, what it needs, what brings it pleasure, what causes it pain. It means being able to advocate for yourself in medical settings, to communicate clearly about your experiences, to recognize when something is wrong and when something is simply different. For women who have spent decades in long-term relationships, body literacy often develops within the context of partnered sexuality. You learn what you like through interaction with someone else. But when that relationship ends, whether through death, divorce, or choice, many women find themselves strangely disconnected from their own bodies. They know what their partner liked, they know what worked in the context of that relationship, but they've never really explored their own body independently, understood their own responses, learned how to pleasure themselves. Masturbation after 60, particularly for women in this situation, becomes an essential practice in reclaiming body literacy. It's not about replacing a partner or compensating for loneliness. It's about knowing yourself, understanding your body, maintaining that connection with your capacity for pleasure so that you remain present, alive, and engaged with your own physical experience. Listen carefully to what I'm about to say, because this is where we confront one of the deepest myths about aging and femininity. Your value as a woman, your dignity, your worth doesn't diminish because you still experience desire. Your sexuality isn't something childish that you're supposed to outgrow, like believing in fairy tales or playing dress up. It's a fundamental part of being human, and it remains part of who you are throughout your entire life. The women I see in my practice who maintain the healthiest relationship with aging, who describe the highest quality of life, the greatest sense of purpose and vitality, are consistently women who have refused to internalize the narrative that they should become invisible, asexual, non-threatening versions of themselves. They're women who continue to pursue pleasure, whether that's sexual pleasure, creative pleasure, intellectual pleasure, physical pleasure. They haven't given up on the idea that their bodies are sources of joy, rather than just collections of aches and problems to be managed. Now let's address something that might be making you uncomfortable right now. If you're feeling resistance to this conversation, if you're thinking, this doesn't apply to me, or I'm not interested in this anymore, I want you to ask yourself an honest question. Is that truly how you feel, or is that what you've been taught you're supposed to feel? Have you genuinely lost interest in physical pleasure, or have you simply buried it under layers of shame, exhaustion, and internalized messaging that tells you wanting pleasure at your age makes you inappropriate, desperate, or pathetic? I can't answer that question for you. Only you know the truth. But I can tell you that I've sat with enough women who initially insisted they had no interest in sexuality, who later, in a safe space, admitted that they think about it constantly. They miss it terribly. They just don't know how to reclaim it without feeling ashamed. The shame, not the lack of desire, is the problem. Rosa came to see me at 64 with what she described as complete loss of libido. She'd been divorced for 8 years and hadn't been in a relationship since. She told me she was fine with it, that she'd moved beyond all that her life was full and satisfying without sexuality. But as we talked, cracks appeared in that narrative. She mentioned feeling irritable all the time. She described trouble sleeping. She talked about a pervasive sense of restlessness that she couldn't explain or satisfy. I asked her when she'd last experienced an orgasm. She looked at me like I'd asked something inappropriate. "Doctor, I'm 64 years old. That part of my life is over." I asked her why. She couldn't give me a medical reason. She could only say, "Women my age don't do that." I asked her where that rule came from, who made it, what happens if you break it. She had no answer. We talked about the physiological benefits of sexual pleasure that I described earlier. We talked about the fact that her irritability and restlessness might actually be her body's way of signaling unmet needs. We talked about the difference between culturally imposed shame and genuine lack of interest. And I gave her permission. Not that she needed my permission, but sometimes we need someone with authority to say it out loud. There is nothing wrong with you for wanting pleasure. There is nothing inappropriate about touching your own body. You don't need a partner to justify your sexuality. 6 months later, Rosa came back for a follow-up. She looked different, lighter somehow, more present. She told me she'd started slowly, just allowing herself to notice pleasure again without judgment, the sensation of a good stretch, warm bath, favorite music. Eventually, she'd worked up the courage to touch herself sexually, and she'd cried afterwards, not from shame but from relief, from the realization of how much she'd been missing, how disconnected she'd become from her own body. She said something I'll never forget. "I feel like I've been holding my breath for 8 years, and I finally remembered how to exhale." That's what happens when we internalize shame around our sexuality. We hold our breath, we tense up, we disconnect. And we convince ourselves that the numbness is peace, that the disconnection is maturity, that the absence of desire is freedom from complication. But it's not. It's just another form of self-abandonment. Let me give you a different framework for thinking about masturbation at any age, but particularly after 60. Think of it as a form of meditation, of mindfulness, of intentional presence in your body. We talk all the time about the importance of mindfulness practices, about being present, about connecting with physical sensation. We encourage yoga, deep breathing, body scans. But somehow when that physical sensation is explicitly pleasurable, when it's sexual, we categorize it differently. We make it shameful, inappropriate, something to be hidden. Why? Sexual pleasure is one of the most intense forms of present-moment awareness available to humans. When you're experiencing genuine physical pleasure, you are absolutely in your body, absolutely in the present moment. Your mind isn't spiraling into anxious future scenarios or ruminating on past regrets. You're here, now, fully embodied, fully alive. That kind of presence is healing. It's grounding. It reconnects you with your body in ways that are increasingly difficult to access as we age in a culture that treats aging bodies primarily as problems to be solved, symptoms to be managed, decline to be delayed. Intentional pleasure reminds you that your body isn't just a vehicle for pain and aging. It's still capable of sensation, of joy, of experiences that make you glad to be alive. One of the most heartbreaking patterns I see in my practice is women who have completely dissociated from their bodies because inhabiting them has become too painful, not physically painful necessarily, but emotionally painful. Looking in the mirror and seeing aging. Feeling invisible in social spaces, navigating a world that constantly reinforces that your value has diminished. It becomes easier to just disconnect, to live primarily in your head, to treat your body as something you're stuck managing rather than something you're grateful to inhabit. Reconnecting with pleasure, including sexual pleasure, is a radical act of reclaiming your body. It's saying, yes, I'm aging, yes, my body has changed, and yes, it's still worthy of pleasure, still capable of joy, still mine to enjoy. Now let's talk about the practical barriers that prevent women from maintaining a healthy relationship with their sexuality after 60, because acknowledging the importance of something doesn't automatically make it accessible. First, there's the physical changes that occur after menopause. Decreased estrogen affects vaginal tissue, causing thinning, decreased elasticity, and reduced lubrication. This can make any kind of sexual activity, including masturbation, uncomfortable or even painful. But here's the critical point. These changes are manageable. Vaginal moisturizers used regularly can help maintain tissue health. Water-based lubricants make sexual activity comfortable. Vaginal estrogen, applied topically, can restore tissue health for many women without the systemic risks associated with hormone replacement therapy. The tragedy is that many women experience these physical changes, and instead of seeking solutions, they simply accept discomfort as inevitable and stop engaging with their sexuality entirely. It's like experiencing pain when walking and deciding to never walk again instead of getting a diagnosis and treatment. You wouldn't do that with walking. Don't do it with sexuality. Second, there's the mental barrier of changed body image. Many women tell me they don't feel sexy anymore, that they can't enjoy sexual pleasure because they're too aware of how their body has changed. I understand this. I recognize the impact of living in a culture that has very narrow definitions of what bodies are allowed to be sexual, but I also want to challenge it, because sexual pleasure happens in your nervous system, not in your appearance. Your orgasm doesn't care what you look like. Your nerve endings don't check the mirror before they respond to stimulation. This isn't about embracing toxic positivity or pretending you love every change aging brings. It's about refusing to let cultural beauty standards steal your capacity for pleasure. You don't have to love how your body looks to honor how it feels. You don't have to perform sexual attractiveness for an imaginary audience when you're alone in your bedroom connecting with yourself. Third, there's the logistical reality that many women at this age are not living alone. You might be living with adult children who have moved back home. You might be caring for aging parents. You might be sharing space with grandchildren. Privacy becomes complicated, but complicated doesn't mean impossible. It means being intentional. It means setting boundaries. It means recognizing that your need for privacy, for time alone, for space to tend to your own needs is legitimate and important. I've had patients tell me they feel guilty taking time for themselves when there are always people who need something from them. And I tell them what I'll tell you now. You cannot pour from an empty cup. Taking care of your own needs, including your need for pleasure, for connection with your body, for experiences that replenish you rather than deplete you, isn't selfish. It's essential maintenance that allows you to show up for others without resentment, without burning out, without losing yourself entirely in service to everyone else's needs. Fourth, there's the grief that many women carry around changes in their sexual expression. Maybe you're no longer in a relationship and you miss partnered sexuality. Maybe your partner is no longer able to be sexual due to illness or dysfunction. Maybe the kind of sexuality you used to enjoy is no longer accessible for various reasons. That grief is real and valid. But grief and adaptation can coexist. You can mourn what's changed while still exploring what's possible now. Masturbation in this context isn't a sad substitute. It's a different expression of sexuality, one that has its own value. It's not better or worse than partnered sexuality. It's simply different, and it offers things that partnered sexuality doesn't. Complete control over pace and intensity, no need to communicate or negotiate, ability to focus entirely on your own sensation without concern for anyone else's needs or expectations, freedom to explore and experiment without judgment. For women who have spent decades in long-term relationships where sexuality was primarily about mutual pleasure, about connection with a partner, learning to value solo sexuality requires a shift in perspective. It requires seeing yourself as worthy of pleasure not because you're providing it for someone else or sharing it with someone else, but simply because you're a human being with a human body capable of human pleasure. Let me share something else I observe clinically that rarely gets discussed. Women who maintain an active relationship with their sexuality, whether partnered or solo, consistently report better pelvic floor health. This matters enormously for quality of life as you age. Strong pelvic floor muscles support bladder and bowel continence, reduce risk of prolapse, and maintain sexual function. Sexual arousal and orgasm naturally engage and strengthen these muscles. So when we talk about masturbation after 60, we're not just talking about pleasure. We're talking about practical health benefits that impact daily life. We're talking about maintaining muscle tone in ways that support continence, that make you less likely to leak urine when you cough or sneeze or laugh, that help you avoid or manage pelvic organ prolapse. These aren't trivial concerns. These are quality of life issues that affect confidence, social engagement, and independence. But you'll never see a public health campaign encouraging women to masturbate for pelvic floor health, even though the connection is clear and well documented. Why? Because we're more comfortable with women doing Kegel exercises, which can be discussed in sanitized medical language, than with women experiencing sexual pleasure, even though sexual pleasure engages those same muscles more naturally, more effectively, and with the added benefit of neurochemical release that improves mood and reduces stress. The squeamishness around this topic has real medical consequences. It means women aren't getting complete information about maintaining their physical health. It means effective interventions are never mentioned because they involve sexuality. It means women suffer with treatable conditions because the most effective treatment involves confronting cultural taboos around female pleasure. I want to shift gears now and talk about something that might surprise you: the relationship between sexual pleasure and cognitive health as we age. There's emerging research suggesting that regular sexual activity, including masturbation, may have protective effects against cognitive decline. The mechanisms aren't fully understood yet, but the theory involves improved blood flow to the brain, the neurochemical effects I mentioned earlier, and the cognitive engagement required for sexual fantasy and arousal. Think about what happens cognitively when you engage with your sexuality. You're using imagination, memory, sensory processing, emotional regulation, and physical coordination. You're integrating multiple brain systems in complex ways. This kind of multi-system engagement is exactly what neurologists recommend for maintaining cognitive health. Activities that challenge your brain in varied ways, that require integration across different neural networks. We encourage older adults to do crossword puzzles, learn new languages, take up musical instruments, all with the goal of maintaining cognitive function. But we ignore or actively discourage one of the most engaging, accessible, pleasurable forms of cognitive stimulation available: sexuality. It's another example of how squeamishness around this topic actively harms older women's health. Now, I want to address something that I know some of you are thinking. What about religious or moral objections to masturbation? What if my faith tradition teaches that this is wrong? I'm not here to argue with your religious beliefs. That's between you and your faith community. But I will say this. I've sat with many religious women who have struggled with this exact conflict, and what I've observed is that shame around sexuality rarely leads to spiritual growth or deeper faith. It usually leads to disconnection, guilt, and a relationship with your body characterized by mistrust and fear rather than gratitude and stewardship. If your faith teaches that your body is a gift, a temple, something sacred, then tending to it, understanding it, experiencing it as a source of joy rather than just duty and function, seems consistent with that theology. If your faith teaches compassion, grace, and care for the vulnerable, then extending those values to yourself, to your own needs and experiences, seems consistent with that theology. I'm not a theologian, and I'm not going to tell you what your faith should or shouldn't permit, but I will encourage you to distinguish between authentic spiritual conviction and internalized cultural shame-wearing religious language. Sometimes what we think is spiritual purity is actually just patriarchal control that has taught women to fear and distrust their own bodies, their own desires, their own capacity for pleasure. Have the conversation with your spiritual advisors if you need to, but also ask yourself whose interests are served by teaching women that their sexuality is shameful, dangerous, or inappropriate. Because historically, controlling women's sexuality has been about controlling women, not about protecting them or elevating them spiritually. Let's talk about another aspect of this that complicates the conversation for many women. The reality that you might be re-entering the dating world at this age, whether by choice or circumstance, and you're navigating sexuality in a completely different landscape than the last time you were single. Multiple women have told me they're terrified to date because they don't know how their body works anymore. They haven't been sexual in years. They're afraid they won't know what to do, or they won't be able to perform, or their body won't respond the way it used to. And I tell them, this is exactly why maintaining your own sexual practice is important. You need to know your body, understand how it responds, what it needs, what brings you pleasure, so that if and when you choose to be sexual with a partner, you can communicate clearly and confidently. Entering a new sexual relationship without any recent experience with your own body is like trying to give someone directions to your house when you haven't lived there in years. You're operating on outdated information. You don't know what's changed. You can't communicate clearly about what you need because you don't know yourself. Masturbation isn't practice for partnered sex exactly, but it is the foundation of body literacy that makes partnered sex more satisfying and less anxiety-provoking. When you know how your body responds, you can guide a partner. When you understand that you need more time, more lubrication, different stimulation than you used to, you can communicate that confidently instead of feeling broken or inadequate. And here's something else. Many women discover that sexuality at this age is actually better than it was when they were younger. With less concern about pregnancy, often with grown children and fewer time constraints, with decades of life experience that have taught you what matters and what doesn't, with less need to perform femininity or sexuality for anyone else's expectations, you're free to explore what you actually enjoy rather than what you think you're supposed to enjoy. Several of my patients have described their 60s as a sexual renaissance, a time when they finally gave themselves permission to experiment, to explore, to figure out what genuinely brings them pleasure rather than what they've been told should bring them pleasure. For some women, this includes masturbation for the first time in their lives, having spent decades focused exclusively on partnered sexuality without ever really exploring their own body independently. The liberation that comes with that discovery, with finally understanding your own response and what you genuinely enjoy, is profound. It's not just about physical pleasure, though, that matters. It's about the realization that you still have capacity for new experiences, for learning, for discovery, that you haven't become fixed and finished, that there are still aspects of yourself you don't fully know yet. I want to tell you about Elena, who came to see me at 71. She'd been widowed for 3 years and had recently started dating someone, the first relationship since her husband's death. She was excited but also terrified because she hadn't been sexual in over 4 years, since before her husband's illness. She told me she'd tried to masturbate to practice, but she couldn't achieve orgasm. Her body didn't seem to respond the way it used to, and she was convinced something was broken. We talked about how her body had changed, about the longer arousal time that's normal after menopause, about the importance of lubrication and taking time. I asked her how she was approaching masturbation, and she described what sounded like a very goal-oriented, efficient process focused entirely on genital stimulation with the expectation of quick orgasm. I explained that her body doesn't work that way anymore, not because it's broken, but because it's changed, that she needed to approach it more holistically, more slowly, incorporating sensual touch all over her body, giving herself time, using fantasy or erotica if helpful, understanding that arousal might take 15 or 20 minutes instead of 5. She came back a month later, smiling. She told me she'd followed my suggestions, had been more patient with herself, had explored what felt good rather than just trying to achieve orgasm as quickly as possible. She said, "Doctor, I had the best orgasm of my life last week. I didn't even know that was possible at my age." That's what happens when we replace shame and misinformation with accurate information and self-compassion. Your body doesn't stop working, but it might work differently, and that's okay. Different doesn't mean worse. Sometimes it means better because you're finally paying attention, you're finally taking your time, you're finally prioritizing your actual experience over performance or efficiency. We're about 90 minutes into this conversation, and I want to check in with you. Are you still uncomfortable? Are you waiting for me to reveal that secret harm that justifies the title? Here it is, the fatal mistake. Believing the lie that you don't deserve pleasure, that your body is no longer worthy of joy. That wanting sexuality at this age makes you inappropriate or pathetic or sad. That belief, that internalized shame, that's what's killing you. Slowly, quietly, by convincing you to abandon your body, to disconnect from your capacity for pleasure, to treat aging as a process of diminishment rather than transformation. The neural pathways that carry pleasure signals don't disappear, but if you never use them, if you actively suppress them because you're ashamed, they do weaken. Neuroplasticity works both ways. The connections you use regularly strengthen, the connections you ignore atrophy. When you systematically deprive yourself of pleasure, you are literally reshaping your brain in ways that make it harder to experience joy, that reinforce depression and anxiety, that disconnect you from your body. That's the fatal mistake. Not masturbation, not sexuality, not pleasure. The fatal mistake is believing you have to give those up to be appropriate, dignified, acceptable as an older woman. Let me tell you what I want for you instead. I want you to reclaim your body as your own, not as an object for someone else's pleasure or judgment, but as your home, your instrument, your source of sensation and joy. I want you to understand that maintaining connection with your capacity for pleasure isn't frivolous or selfish or inappropriate. It's essential self-care that supports your mental health, your physical health, your quality of life. I want you to stop apologizing for having needs, for wanting pleasure, for taking up space in your own life. I want you to recognize that the discomfort you feel around this topic isn't coming from your body. It's coming from internalized cultural messages that have systematically taught women to be ashamed of their sexuality, particularly as they age. And I want you to know that it's never too late to change your relationship with your body, to rediscover pleasure, to reconnect with sensation. Whether you're 60 or 70 or 80 or 90, your body still has capacity for pleasure. You still have the right to pursue it. You still deserve joy. The question isn't whether you should masturbate after 60. The question is whether you're going to let shame dictate your relationship with your body, or whether you're going to claim your right to pleasure, to body literacy, to the full experience of being alive in your skin. One final story before we start wrapping up. Dorothy was 76 when I met her. She'd never been married, had spent her life in a career she loved, had rich friendships and a full life. She told me she'd never masturbated, not once in her entire life, because she'd been raised in a religious household that taught her that any sexual expression outside of marriage was sinful, and she'd simply never married. She was coming to see me because of persistent pelvic pain that no one had been able to diagnose or treat effectively. We talked for a long time about her body, her relationship with physical sensation, her comfort with touch. Eventually, it became clear that she had never, not once in 76 years, touched her own genitals except to clean them. She had no body literacy whatsoever about that part of herself. I explained that the pelvic floor muscles, when held chronically tense, can cause significant pain, and that one of the ways to release that tension is through arousal and orgasm. She looked at me like I'd suggested something impossible, but she was in pain daily and nothing else had worked, so she agreed to try. I gave her very specific, clinical guidance about how to explore her body, how to use touch to identify areas of tension, how arousal and orgasm create a natural release of pelvic floor muscles that have been chronically contracted. I framed it entirely as a medical intervention, which it was, and gave her permission to explore something she'd been taught her entire life was forbidden. She came back 6 weeks later with tears in her eyes. "Doctor," she said, "I'm 76 years old, and I just discovered that my body has been capable of this my entire life, and I never knew. I've been in pain for years. And the solution was inside me the whole time, but I was too ashamed to ever look." Her pain had improved significantly. But more than that, she described feeling like she'd finally met herself, like there was a part of her that had been locked away her entire life that she'd finally given herself permission to know. I tell you this story because it illustrates something crucial. The harm isn't just what happens when you stop engaging with your sexuality at 60 or 70. The harm is cumulative across decades of shame, disconnection, and fear. And the possibility for healing, for reconnection, for discovery exists at any age if you're willing to challenge the beliefs that have kept you separated from your own body. Maybe you're thinking, "But I'm too old to start now. I've gone too long without this." It's too late. Let me be absolutely clear. It's not too late. Your body doesn't retire from the capacity for pleasure. Your nerve endings don't have expiration dates. Your right to understand and experience your own body doesn't diminish with age. It might take time to reconnect if you've been disconnected for years. It might feel awkward or uncomfortable at first. You might need to work through layers of shame and misinformation. But the capacity is there, and the benefits, mental, emotional, physical, are worth the effort. Here's what I want you to do this week. I want you to create space for pleasure in some form. It doesn't have to be sexual immediately if that feels too intimidating. Start with whatever form of physical pleasure feels accessible. A long bath with good-smelling soap, dancing alone in your living room, getting a massage, eating something delicious slowly and intentionally. Practice paying attention to sensation without judgment, without immediately moving to the next task, without apologizing for taking time for something that serves no purpose except that it feels good. Practice inhabiting your body as a source of pleasure rather than just a collection of problems to be managed. And if you feel ready, if you feel curious, Give yourself permission to explore sexual pleasure again, whether you're reclaiming something you've given up or discovering something for the first time. Approach it with patience, with curiosity, with self-compassion. Use good lubrication. Take your time. Let go of expectations about what should happen and just notice what does happen. You don't have to achieve orgasm. You don't have to perform anything. You don't have to prove anything. Just connect with your body, notice what feels good, and give yourself permission to pursue more of whatever that is. Your body is yours. It has been your constant companion through every experience of your life. It has carried you, protected you, healed you, allowed you to experience the world, and it still right now has capacity for pleasure, for sensation, for experiences that make you glad to be alive in your skin. Don't let shame steal that from you. Don't let cultural messages about appropriate aging convince you that you're supposed to become a sanitized, desexualized, non-threatening version of yourself who takes up less space, has fewer needs, asks for nothing. You are allowed to want pleasure. You are allowed to pursue it. You are allowed to take time for yourself, to prioritize your needs, to say yes to experiences that replenish you rather than deplete you. Not because you're being selfish or inappropriate, but because you're a human being who deserves joy, who deserves to feel alive, who deserves to inhabit your body as home rather than prison. The fatal mistake isn't masturbation after 60. The fatal mistake is believing you don't deserve pleasure and letting that belief slowly kill your connection with your body, your capacity for joy, your sense of aliveness. So here's your challenge. Reclaim something this week. Reclaim pleasure. Reclaim your body. Reclaim your right to pursue what makes you feel alive. And then come back and tell me about it. Comment below with what you discovered, what surprised you, what challenged you. Let's create a space where women can talk honestly about these experiences without shame, without judgment, with the understanding that we all deserve joy regardless of age. Subscribe to this channel if you want more conversations that tell you the truth even when it's uncomfortable, that treat you like an intelligent adult capable of making informed decisions about your own body and life, that refuse to sanitize reality to make it more palatable. And share this video with another woman who needs to hear it, who's been taught that her sexuality has an expiration date, who's been carrying shame that isn't hers, who deserves permission to reclaim pleasure. We need to talk about these things openly, honestly, without euphemism or apology, because silence serves shame, and shame serves no one. Your body is capable of pleasure throughout your entire life. You don't lose that capacity at menopause or at 60 or at any other arbitrary threshold. What you lose is cultural permission, social validation, the message that your pleasure matters. But you don't need permission from culture or society or anyone else to touch your own body, to pursue your own pleasure, to claim your right to joy. I'm Dr. Valeria Montez, and I'm telling you, with complete medical authority and 2 decades of clinical experience, there is nothing wrong with you for wanting pleasure at this age. There is nothing inappropriate about touching your own body. There is nothing shameful about masturbation after 60 or 70 or 80 or ever. What's shameful is a culture that has convinced women their sexuality should disappear to make everyone else more comfortable. What's harmful is systematic erasure of older women's sexuality to the point where you've internalized the belief that wanting pleasure makes you broken or desperate or pathetic. You're not broken. Your body is not the problem. The problem is shame, misinformation, and a culture that profits from women feeling inadequate and disconnected from their bodies. Reclaim yourself. Reclaim pleasure. Reclaim the understanding that your body is worthy of joy. And let's change this conversation together, one woman at a time, until we've created a world where women at every age can pursue pleasure without shame, can inhabit their bodies without apology, can age with dignity that includes, not excludes, sexuality. Thank you for staying with me through this entire conversation. I know it was uncomfortable at times. That discomfort is where growth happens. Subscribe, comment, share, and most importantly, give yourself permission to explore what we've discussed today. Your body has been waiting for you to come home.